Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
For years, I was invisible to my family, the forgotten child who never got the attention or support my siblings did. But when I finally found success on my own terms, everything changed. Suddenly, they wanted to be part of my life, to share in my achievements. But where were they when I needed them most? Growing up, I always felt like I was invisible in my own family. My parents were consumed with the needs of my two older siblings, leaving little room for me. My brother, Adam, was the golden child, brilliant in academics, a star athlete, and the apple of my parents' eyes. My sister, Rachel, had a natural knack for drama, captivating everyone with her bold personality and flair for the theatrical. And then there was me, quiet, bookish, and content to observe from the sidelines. I didn't demand attention the way they did. I learned early on that in our household, the loudest voices got the most notice. My birthday parties were usually last-minute affairs, if they happened at all. My achievements were rarely celebrated, often eclipsed by Adam's latest win or Rachel's newest performance. I remember one moment in middle school that stayed with me for years. I'd entered a district-wide writing contest and won first place. It felt like a huge deal. My name was printed in the local newspaper, and my teacher had even announced it in front of the whole class. I came home beaming, eager to share the news with my parents. But when I told them, my mom barely looked up from her cooking. "That's nice, sweetheart," she said absently before turning to my dad to ask what time Adam's basketball game started. It was always like that. No matter how hard I tried, my accomplishments were met with polite indifference at best. At worst, they were ignored altogether. By the time I reached high school, I'd stopped trying to get their attention. I threw myself into my hobbies instead. Books became my sanctuary, a world where I was the main character, where I could imagine myself as someone important, someone worthy of notice. I spent hours at the library, losing myself in stories about people who rose above their circumstances, who found their place in the world despite the odds. I also started journaling, pouring my thoughts on a paper when I felt like I couldn't share them with anyone else. My journal became a lifeline, a place where I could express the hurt I didn't dare voice out loud. But even as I told myself it didn't matter, the ache of being overlooked never fully went away. It was there in the small moments. The family dinners where Adam dominated the conversation, the school events where Rachel's drama club got all the applause, the nights when I'd sit alone in my room while the rest of the family crowded around the TV to watch Adam's game highlights. I tried to make peace with it, telling myself that one day I'd leave and build a life of my own, a life where I wouldn't need their attention or approval. But deep down, I couldn't help wondering why I wasn't enough. What was it about me that made it so easy for them to forget I was there? That question followed me everywhere, shaping how I saw myself and my place in the world. And though I couldn't have known it then, it was a question I'd spend years trying to answer. By the time I reached high school, I had fully embraced my role as the background character in my family's story. It wasn't a conscious decision. I didn't wake up one day and decide I didn't matter. But over time, the pattern became clear. My brother's sports trophies were prominently displayed on the living room shelves, glinting in the sunlight as if to remind everyone of his constant victories. My sister's theater posters covered every inch of wall space, her dramatic poses frozen in time for all to admire. And then there was me. My certificates, ribbons, and awards, few as they were, lived in a drawer in my room, unseen by anyone but me. If I had to pick a single image to sum up my place in the family, it would be the living room shelf. Every trophy, every photo, every memento told a story of Adam and Rachel. My story wasn't there. There was one night during my junior year that cemented this feeling for me. I had spent weeks working on a project for the state science fair, a complex model of a renewable energy system that combines solar and wind power. I poured hours into perfecting every detail, staying up late after school and sacrificing weekends to make it just right. When I found out I'd earned a spot at the state competition, I was thrilled. It felt like validation for all the hard work I'd put in, and I couldn't wait to show my parents what I'd accomplished. I told them about the event weeks in advance, even leaving a flyer on the fridge with the date and time circled in bold red ink. The night of the science fair, I stood by my project, looking over the crowd for my parents. Other kids' families were there, moms snapping photos, dads asking questions, siblings tagging along for support. But as the evening wore on, it became clear that my parents weren't coming. When I got home, my mom met me at the door, her expression a mix of guilt and indifference. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, not meeting my eyes. We completely forgot. Adam had a game tonight. And you know how important those are? I later found out it wasn't just a regular game. It was an exhibition match, barely worth the effort they'd spent cheering from the bleachers. But to them, it was still more important than showing up for me. Moments like that became a regular occurrence. The time I got a part-time job, and no one asked about my first day. The time I made the honor roll, and my mom barely looked up from her phone when I told her. The time I graduated with distinction, and my family spent the ceremony whispering about Adam's upcoming playoff game. Eventually, I stopped expecting them to show up. It hurt less to keep my successes to myself than to face the inevitable lukewarm reaction. Or worse, the excuse that something else was more important. But even as I learned to keep my accomplishments quiet, a part of me still longed for their recognition. I wanted them to see me, to acknowledge that I was more than just the quiet, dependable one who didn't cause any trouble. I began to channel that frustration into my work. Whether it was a school project, a part-time job, or a personal hobby, I poured my energy into proving, if only to myself, that I was capable of great things. I told myself that one day, I'd escape the shadows of my siblings and find a place where I truly belonged. I clung to that hope like a lifeline, even when it felt impossibly far away. And though I didn't know it then, those years of fading into the background were shaping me into someone who would one day stand on her own, without needing anyone's approval to do so. College was my first taste of freedom, and I embraced it with everything I had. When it came time to choose a school, I didn't just look at the programs or the campus. I looked at the distance. I picked a university 2 states away, far enough that I wouldn't be expected to come home for every holiday or family dinner. I wanted a clean break, a chance to step out of the shadow of my siblings and the suffocating indifference I'd grown up with. Moving into my dorm felt like stepping into a new world. For the first time, I wasn't Adam and Rachel's little sister. I was just me, and I could decide who that was going to be. No one cared about my family dynamics or my role as the forgotten child. All they saw was a quiet, determined freshman who was ready to make her mark. I threw myself into my studies with a sense of purpose I'd never felt before. In high school, my accomplishments had always been met with indifference, but here, they mattered. Professors praised my work ethic, classmates sought me out for group projects, and for the first time, I felt like my efforts were seen and valued. I also started building friendships that felt genuine and reciprocal, relationships where I wasn't overshadowed or overlooked. My roommate, Emma, was one of the first people to truly get me. She was loud and bubbly, the kind of person who filled a room with her presence, but she had a way of making me feel heard. "You're so smart," she said one night as we worked on assignments together in our dorm. "You don't even realize it, do you?" Her words stuck with me. I'd spent so much of my life feeling invisible that I didn't know how to handle being noticed. But Emma's friendship, along with the connections I made with others, started to chip away at the walls I'd built around myself. For the first time, I began to believe that maybe I was worth noticing after all. Meanwhile, my relationship with my family remained distant, both literally and emotionally. My parents rarely called, and when they did, the conversations were predictable. "Adam just got promoted," my mom would gush. "He's doing so well at work." "Rachel landed the lead in another play," my dad would add. "Isn't that exciting?" They didn't mean to hurt me. At least I don't think they did. But the calls were a reminder of the dynamic I'd left behind. My siblings were still the stars of the family, while I was the one they barely asked about. "How's school going?" my mom would ask as an afterthought, her tone distracted. "It's good," I'd say, keeping my answers short. I learned not to expect genuine interest, so I stopped offering details. By then, though, it didn't bother me as much. I was building something for myself, something that didn't rely on their approval or acknowledgement. My achievements, my friendships, my growth, they were mine, and that was enough. As the semesters passed, I began to feel a sense of clarity about my place in the world. I didn't need to chase after my family's attention or prove my worth to them. The validation I'd craved for so long was something I could give myself. College wasn't just an education. It was a rebirth. It was the place where I started to redefine who I was and what I wanted from life. And for the first time, I felt like I was finally breaking away from the forgotten child I'd been for so many years. Graduating college felt like crossing a finish line, but I quickly realized it was just the starting point for the next race. Armed with a degree and a determination to succeed, I dove headfirst into the job market. After countless applications and interviews, I landed a position at a tech company, a role that didn't pay much at first but promised opportunities for growth. Those first few years were tough. The hours were long, and the workload was demanding. I often felt like I had to work twice as hard to prove myself in an industry filled with ambitious overachievers. But I thrived on the challenge. Every late night, every project completed ahead of schedule, every client I impressed felt like another brick in the foundation I was building for my future. I wasn't just working for a paycheck. I was working to prove something to myself. I wanted to show that I could build a life that was completely mine, free from the shadow of my family's neglect and the need for their approval. My hard work paid off. After a couple of years, I earned my first promotion. The raise that came with it felt like validation for all the sacrifices I'd made. But it was more than just the money. It was the recognition that I'd earned my place. With the promotions came new responsibilities, but I embraced them. I found myself leading a team, mentoring junior employees, and contributing to decisions that shaped the company's direction. I was no longer the quiet observer in the background. I was someone people looked to for guidance and expertise. As my career grew, so did my confidence. I saved enough to buy my first car, a sleek new model that felt like a symbol of how far I'd come. Driving it off the lot, I couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. It wasn't just a car. It was a tangible reminder of everything I'd achieved on my own. Not long after, I took another big step. I bought my own house. It wasn't a mansion, but it was everything I wanted: a cozy, stylish place in a quiet neighborhood where I could finally feel at home. I spent weeks decorating it, choosing furniture and artwork that reflected my personality. Every room felt like an extension of who I was, a space I could truly call my own. For the first time in my life, I felt completely in control. My accomplishments weren't tied to anyone else. They were the result of my own hard work and determination. I didn't need my family's approval or support because I'd done it all without them. But as much as I tried to let go of the past, a part of me couldn't help but wonder if they even noticed. Did my parents know I'd bought a house? Did they care that I was thriving in a career I loved? Or was I still the forgotten child? Even now, sometimes I catch myself imagining what it would be like to share my success with them. Would they finally be proud of me? Would they recognize how far I'd come and how hard I'd worked to get here? But then I'd remember the years of indifference, the times they'd overlooked my accomplishments or dismissed them altogether. I wasn't sure I could handle putting myself out there again, only to be met with lukewarm acknowledgement, or worse, indifference. So I kept my successes to myself, just as I had in high school. I celebrated with friends and colleagues, the people who had supported me along the way. And though there was still a lingering ache for the recognition I'd never had, it grew quieter with each new milestone I achieved. I was building a life I was proud of, one step at a time, and whether my family noticed or not, I knew I was finally stepping into my own. It had been years since I'd moved out and started building my life, and I'd grown used to the lack of communication with my family. Aside from the occasional holiday card or obligatory birthday text, our interactions were minimal. That's why I was surprised to see my mom's name pop up on my phone one evening. "Hi, sweetie," she said, her tone unnaturally bright. I was immediately suspicious. My mom wasn't the type to call just to chat. "Hi," I replied cautiously. "What's up?" "We're so proud of you," she said, completely out of the blue. "Your dad and I were just talking about how much you've accomplished. You've really made something of yourself." I paused, unsure how to respond. This was the first time I could remember her saying anything like that. For years, my achievements had been met with indifference if they were acknowledged at all. Thanks," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "You deserve it," she continued. "You've worked so hard, and it's paid off. We always knew you had it in you." That line almost made me laugh. "Did you, though?" I thought but didn't say. The call ended shortly after, and while I appreciated the sentiment, something about it didn't sit right. My parents had never been particularly interested in my career or my life. Why now? The second call came a few days later, and this time, there was no subtlety. "Your dad and I were talking," my mom began, her tone more businesslike. "And we were wondering if you might be able to help your sister out. She's having some trouble making rent this month, and we know you're in a good place financially." I froze. My first instinct was to laugh. It felt so absurd, but the seriousness in her voice stopped me. "Help her out?" I repeated, trying to buy time to process what I was hearing. "Yes," she said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "We know things have been tight for Rachel, and since you're doing so well, we thought you might be able to step in." It wasn't a request. It was an expectation. For years, I'd been the forgotten child, left to fend for myself while my siblings basked in my parents' attention and support. And now, out of nowhere, they wanted a piece of my success? "I'll have to think about it," I said finally, my voice colder than I intended. "Of course," she replied, though there was a hint of disappointment in her tone. "We just thought you want to help." After the call, I sat on the couch, staring at my phone. The audacity of it all was almost comical. Where had they been when I was struggling to make ends meet after college? Where were the offers to help out when I needed support? And yet, a small part of me felt guilty for saying no. Rachel was my sister, and I didn't want to see her struggle. But this wasn't just about her. It was about the years of neglect and the sudden shift in my family's dynamic now that I was successful. A week later, my mom called again. This time it was about Adam. He's been having car trouble, she said. You know how expensive repairs can be. We thought maybe you could lend him some money to get it fixed. The pattern was becoming clear. My success had turned me into the family's safety net, their go-to solution for financial problems. But what they didn't seem to realize was that I wasn't a resource to be used. I was their daughter, their sibling, and I'd spent years feeling like I didn't matter to them. I knew I needed to set boundaries, but I wasn't sure how to do it without fracturing our already fragile relationships. The shift in how they treated me felt less like acknowledgement and more like opportunism, and I couldn't shake the bitterness that came with it. They hadn't cared about my successes when I was building my life from the ground up, but now that I had made it, they wanted to reap the benefits. It wasn't pride in my achievements that brought them back into my life, it was convenience. And for the first time in years, I started to wonder if I even wanted them in my life at all. What started with Rachel's rent spiraled into a cascade of requests that I hadn't seen coming. At first, I tried to rationalize it. She's family, and I can afford it. One time won't hurt. But I quickly learned that in my family, generosity was a slippery slope. Not long after I helped Rachel, my brother Adam called. Hey, he started casually. Mom said you were able to help Rachel out, and well, I was wondering if you might be able to do the same for me. What's going on? I asked, already bracing myself. My car's on its last leg, he said with a dramatic sigh. I've been saving for a down payment, but I'm still short. If you could spot me a couple thousand, I'd pay you back as soon as I can. I wanted to laugh. Adam, the golden child who had never gone without, was now asking me, a person who had been overlooked for years, to bail him out. I'll think about it, I said, though I already knew my answer. The request didn't stop there. A few weeks later, my mom called with a new favor. The roof on the house is starting to leak, she said, her tone laced with concern. We've been getting quotes, but it's more expensive than we thought. Since you're doing so well, we thought you might want to help. I almost dropped the phone. Help with the roof? I repeated, incredulous. Yes, she said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. You've been so fortunate lately, and this would mean a lot to us. Every call seemed to bring a new demand, each one couched in the language of obligation and guilt. We're family, my mom would say, and family helps each other. The subtext was clear. My success wasn't just mine. It was theirs to share, to use as they saw fit. At first, I tried to set boundaries. I can't help right now, I'd say, or that's not something I can commit to. But every time I said no, it was met with guilt tripping. After everything we've done for you, my mom would say, her voice heavy with disappointment. We supported you when you needed it. We're not asking for much. It took everything in me not to snap. When exactly did you support me? I wanted to scream, but I bit my tongue, not wanting to escalate the tension. The worst part was how quickly I went from being their forgotten child to their financial safety net. They didn't call to ask how I was doing or show any interest in my life. Every conversation revolved around what I could give them, as if my success was a communal resource and not the result of years of hard work. The more I pushed back, the more strained our relationship became. My mom started hinting that I was being selfish. You've changed, she said during one call. You used to be so generous. Generous? I repeated, my voice tight. Mom, I've been generous, but I can't solve everyone's problems just because I'm doing well now. Her silence on the other end of the line was deafening. When she finally spoke, her tone was sharp. I guess we know where we stand then. The strain wasn't limited to my parents. Adam didn't take my refusal to help with his car well. You can't seriously think it's a big deal, he said when I told him no. It's not like you can't afford it. It's not about whether I can afford it, I replied, trying to keep my frustration in check. It's about the fact that I'm not a bank. If I say yes every time, where does it end? I didn't realize you were keeping score, he shot back, his tone dripping with sarcasm. That was the moment I realized just how little they understood or cared about my perspective. To them, my success was a pool they could dip into whenever they wanted, and any hesitation on my part was seen as a betrayal. I started to dread the sound of my phone ringing, knowing it would likely be another request disguised as a conversation. Each interaction left me feeling more like a resource than a person, and the resentment I'd worked so hard to bury began to resurface. I knew I had to make a choice. Keep giving in and let their demands consume me, or finally draw a line and risk losing whatever fragile connection we still had. It wasn't an easy decision, but deep down, I knew what I had to do. For years, I let myself be defined by their neglect and their expectations. It was time to take back control, even if it meant stepping away from the people who were supposed to love me the most. Setting boundaries wasn't just about protecting my finances, it was about protecting my peace. And I was determined to do whatever it took to hold on to that, no matter how much it hurt. After weeks of mounting frustration and endless guilt tripping, I realized I couldn't continue like this. The resentment building inside me was starting to affect every part of my life, and I knew it was time to address the issue head-on. I decided to invite my family over for dinner, a bold move considering the tension that had been simmering for months. I spent the day preparing a meal, hoping that the effort would set a calm tone for the evening. When my parents and siblings arrived, I greeted them with a smile that felt more forced than I wanted to admit. The small talk at the table was excruciating. My mom commented on how nice my house was, my dad asked about work in the vaguest terms possible, and my siblings seemed more interested in their phones than in engaging with me. The air was thick with unspoken words, and I knew it was up to me to break the silence. After clearing the dishes, I took a deep breath and sat back down at the table. There's something I need to talk about. I began, my voice steady but firm. Everyone looked up, the casual atmosphere evaporating in an instant. I feel like the only time you reach out to me is when you need something, I said, choosing my words carefully. Do you realize how that feels? My mom's eyes widened in surprise. That's not true, she said quickly, her tone defensive. We've always cared about you. Then why didn't it feel that way when I was growing up? The words tumbled out before I could stop them. I was always the forgotten child. And now that I'm successful, it's like I finally exist to you. But only because you want something from me. My dad shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and Adam glanced at Rachel, who avoided my gaze altogether. The silence that followed was deafening. My mom was the first to respond. We didn't mean to make you feel that way, she said, her voice trembling. We love you, and we've always been proud of you. Maybe we just didn't say it enough. I couldn't hold back my frustration. You didn't say it at all, Mom, I replied. I spent my entire childhood trying to get your attention, and it never worked. Now, suddenly, I'm good enough because I'm in a position to help you? That doesn't feel like love. It feels like convenience. Rachel finally spoke up, her voice quiet. I didn't realize you felt that way, she said. I just thought you liked being independent. That's because I didn't have a choice, I shot back. You and Adam always had their attention. I had to figure things out on my own because no one else was going to help me. Adam frowned, leaning forward. That's not fair, he said. We all had our struggles. I'm not saying you didn't, I replied. But the difference is you had their support. I didn't. And now that I've built a life for myself, it feels like I'm being punished for it. The conversation went back and forth for what felt like hours. My mom tried to justify their actions. My dad remained mostly silent, and my siblings alternated between defensiveness and half-hearted apologies. I don't want to fight, I said finally, exhaustion creeping into my voice. I just want you to understand where I'm coming from. I've worked hard to get where I am, and I'm proud of that. But I can't keep being your safety net. It's not fair to me, and it's not fair to our relationship. My mom nodded reluctantly, her expression a mix of guilt and sadness. We'll do better, she said quietly. I mean it. I wanted to believe her, but a part of me couldn't shake the doubt. Words were easy. Actions were harder. As they left that night, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. I'd finally said what I needed to say, but I wasn't sure if anything would actually change. For the first time in years, I confronted the pain of being the forgotten child. And while it felt good to get it out, the road to healing still felt impossibly long. One thing was certain, though, I couldn't go back to the way things were. Whether they understood it or not, I was no longer the child desperate for their approval. I had to protect myself, even if it meant stepping away from them for good. The night of the confrontation lingered in my mind long after my family walked out the door. The conversation had ended on a sour note, with my mom growing more defensive with every word I said. My dad barely spoke, shifting uncomfortably in his chair as if he wished he could vanish altogether. My siblings sat in tense silence, their discomfort as palpable as the unspoken accusations hanging in the air. When they left, I felt a wave of relief, but it was short-lived. The house was unnervingly quiet, and the reality of what had just happened settled over me like a heavy fog. I'd finally said what I'd been holding in for years, but instead of feeling lighter, I felt hollow. I wondered if I'd made things worse by confronting them, or if I'd even been hurt at all. In the weeks that followed, the phone call stopped. At first, I thought it might be temporary, a cooling-off period after a difficult conversation. But as the days stretched into weeks, I realized it wasn't a pause. It was a silence that spoke louder than words ever could. The lack of contact felt jarring. For all the resentment I'd felt about their constant demands, I hadn't been prepared for this stark reminder of how conditional their attention had been. Without something to ask for, it seemed they had no reason to reach out. At first, I felt guilty. I replayed the confrontation in my mind, wondering if I'd been too harsh or said the wrong thing. Was I selfish for wanting to protect myself? Should I have handled it differently? I confided in my friend Emma, who had been my rock through so much of this journey. Do you think I was too hard on them? I asked one afternoon over coffee. Emma shook her head, her expression firm. No, you've spent your whole life putting their needs ahead of your own. Setting boundaries isn't selfish, it's self-respect. If they can't handle that, it's on them, not you. Her words hit home, but they didn't completely erase the doubt. I'd always been the one to compromise, to keep the peace, to avoid rocking the boat. Standing my ground felt foreign and uncomfortable, even if I knew it was the right thing to do. As the days went on, I began to see the silence for what it was, a consequence of years of imbalance and neglect. I wasn't the problem, I never had been. My family's inability to see me as more than a resource was something I couldn't fix, no matter how much I wanted to. Without the constant pressure of their demands, I felt a strange sense of freedom. For the first time, I could focus entirely on myself and my own needs. I threw myself into work, into friendships, into hobbies I hadn't had time for in years. But there were moments when the silence felt heavier. I'd catch myself scrolling through old photos or rereading text messages, wondering if they missed me, or if they even noticed my absence. It was a painful realization that the connections I'd spent so long craving might not have been as deep as I'd hoped. I started seeing a therapist, something I considered for years but never prioritized. Talking through my feelings helped me understand that setting boundaries wasn't just about protecting my time or money. It was about reclaiming my worth. One session, my therapist said something that stayed with me. It's okay to grieve the relationship you wanted but didn't have. That doesn't mean you have to accept less than you deserve. That perspective shifted something inside me. For so long, I'd held on to the hope that my family would change, that they'd see me for who I was and not what I could give them. But hope alone wasn't enough. I had to let go of the version of them I'd imagined and accept the reality of who they were. The silence didn't break, but I stopped waiting for it to. I stopped checking my phone for missed calls or wondering what I could have done differently. Instead, I focused on the relationships in my life that brought me joy and fulfillment. With my family hadn't been easy, and it had come at a cost. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was living for myself, not for their expectations or approval. And that was worth more than anything they could have given me. The silence between my family and me didn't last forever, but the road back was slow and cautious. Over time, I began to rebuild those relationships, but this time, I did it on my terms. After years of being overlooked and later treated as a resource, I knew I couldn't go back to the way things were. If we were going to have any kind of relationship, it had to be honest and respectful, with boundaries that I was no longer afraid to enforce. The first olive branch came from my mom. She called one evening, her voice softer than I was used to. "I just wanted to check in," she said, her tone free of the usual subtext. "We haven't talked in a while, and I miss hearing your voice." For a moment, I was suspicious, expecting a favor to follow. But none came. Instead, we talked about her garden, a recipe she'd tried, and a book she thought I might like. It was the kind of conversation we hadn't had in years, one that wasn't tied to an expectation or an obligation. That call was the start of a tentative thaw. My parents softened in the months that followed, their requests dwindling to nearly nothing. They began calling just to talk, asking about my life in a way that felt more genuine. "How's work?" my dad asked one evening, surprising me. He listened as I told him about a new project I was excited about, his usual stoic demeanor giving way to something that resembled interest. I still kept my guard up, though. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight, and I was determined not to let myself fall back into old patterns. I made it clear, gently but firmly, that I wasn't their ATM. When my mom tentatively brought up a financial issue, I didn't hesitate. "I can't help with that," I said, my voice calm but resolute. "I hope you can understand why." She paused for a moment, then surprised me by saying, "I do. I know we've put too much on you in the past, and I'm sorry for that. Her apology caught me off guard, but it also felt like a step forward. For the first time, I felt like she was acknowledging the imbalance that had strained our relationship for so long. Rebuilding things with my siblings was more complicated. My sister, Rachel, reached out first, her tone hesitant but apologetic. "I've been thinking about what you said," she admitted during a phone call. "And you're right, I took you for granted. I didn't realize how unfair things were until you pointed it out, and I'm sorry for that." Her words felt sincere, and though it didn't erase the past, it was enough for me to let my guard down a little. We started talking more often, finding small ways to reconnect. She even visited me at my house, bringing a bottle of wine as a peace offering. "Your place is amazing," she said, looking around with genuine admiration. "You've built something incredible for yourself." Hearing that meant more than I expected. For so long, I'd felt invisible in my family, but Rachel's acknowledgement felt like a small step toward being truly seen. With my brother, Adam, things remained strained. While Rachel was willing to reflect on our childhood dynamics, Adam seemed unwilling, or perhaps unable, to do the same. He maintained his distance, our conversations brief and surface level when they happened at all. During one rare phone call, I tried to broach the subject. "I feel like we've been drifting apart," I said cautiously. His response was curt. "I don't see the point in rehashing the past. What's done is done." It stung, but I decided not to push further. If Adam wasn't ready to acknowledge the imbalance that had defined our childhood, I couldn't force him. All I could do was protect my own peace and accept that not every relationship could be repaired. Despite the lingering complications with Adam, I felt a growing sense of peace about my family. The relationships I'd rebuilt were far from perfect, but they were more genuine than they'd ever been. I'd stopped trying to fit into the mold of the forgotten child or the family's safety net. Instead, I was carving out a new role, one where my needs and boundaries were just as important as anyone else's. For the first time, I felt like I was truly living life on my terms. And while the journey hadn't been easy, it had taught me the value of self-respect and the importance of standing up for myself, even when it meant walking away. Years have passed since I first set those boundaries with my family, and while the journey hasn't been easy, it's been transformative. I found a sense of peace that once felt impossible, a calmness rooted not in their approval or validation, but in my own growth and accomplishments. I no longer seek their recognition or try to fit into the mold of the person they once expected me to be. Instead, I've built a life that reflects who I truly am. My career is thriving, not because I need to prove anything to anyone, but because I genuinely love the work I do. My friendships are strong and supportive, filled with people who value me for who I am, not for what I can give. My home, once just a symbol of independence, has become a sanctuary. Every corner reflects my personality and choices, from the bookshelves overflowing with my favorite novels to the walls adorned with art that inspires me. It's a space that feels wholly mine, a reminder of how far I've come and how much I've overcome. My relationship with my family is still a work in progress, but I've stopped expecting perfection or even fairness. They're part of my story, and while the past hasn't disappeared, I've learned how to live with it. My parents have made small, meaningful changes. They call more often now, not to ask for help, but simply to check in. My mom has even started asking about my work in a way that feels genuine. "I'm so proud of you," she said during a recent conversation. And while it took time to believe those words, I've started to see them as a step toward healing. Rachel and I have grown closer. She's more self-aware than she used to be, and our conversations feel lighter, less tinged with the shadow of our childhood dynamics. Adam remains distant, but I've stopped letting his detachment bother me. Not every relationship can be repaired, and I've made peace with that. Letting go of the resentment that once consumed me was the hardest part of this journey. For years, I carried the weight of being the forgotten child, of feeling like I had to fight for every bit of attention and acknowledgement. But holding on to that anger only kept me tethered to the pain of the past. Through therapy, self-reflection, and the support of the people who truly cared about me, I've learned to release that burden. I no longer see my family's shortcomings as a reflection of my worth. Their choices were theirs, and while they hurt me, they don't define who I am or what I can achieve. At the end of the day, I've realized that success isn't about proving anyone wrong. It's not about showing my family what they missed or forcing them to see my value. True success is about finding happiness on my own terms, building a life that brings me joy and fulfillment. If I could go back and tell my younger self one thing, it would be this: you are enough. You don't need anyone else to see you to know your worth. That lesson is one I wouldn't trade for anything. It's given me the strength to move forward, to embrace the person I've become, and to let go of the parts of my story that no longer serve me. My family will always be part of my life, but they no longer define it. And for the first time, that feels like enough.